NASA returns to the moon after 52 years. Years late and billions over budget, NASA's new moon rocket makes its debut next week in a high-stakes test flight before astronauts get on top. The 98-meter, 322-foot rocket will attempt to send an empty crew capsule into a far-flung lunar orbit, 50 years after NASA's famed Apollo moonshots. If all goes well, astronauts could strap in as soon as 2024 for a lap around the moon, with NASA aiming to land 2 people on the lunar surface by the end of 2025. Liftoff is set for Monday morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. The 6-week test flight is risky and could be cut short if something fails, NASA officials warn. We're going to stress it and test it. We're going to make it do things that we would never do with a crew on it in order to try to make it as safe as possible, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson told the Associated Press on Wednesday. The retired founder of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute said a lot is riding on this trial run. Spiraling costs and long gaps between missions will make for a tough comeback if things go south, he noted. It is supposed to be the first step in a sustained program of human exploration of the moon, Mars, and beyond, said John Logsdon. Will the United States have the will to push forward in the face of a major malfunction? The price tag for this single mission, more than $4 billion. Add everything up since the program's inception a decade ago until a 2025 lunar landing, and there's even more sticker shock, $93 billion. Here's a rundown of the first flight of the Artemis program, named after Apollo's mythological twin sister. Rocket power. The new rocket is shorter and slimmer than the Saturn V rockets that hurled 24 Apollo astronauts to the moon a half-century ago. But it's mightier, packing 8.8 million pounds, 4 million kilograms, of thrust. It's called the Space Launch System Rocket, SLS for short, but a less clunky name is under discussion, according to Nelson. Unlike the streamlined Saturn V, the new rocket has a pair of strap-on boosters refashioned from NASA's space shuttles. The boosters will peel away after 2 minutes, just like the shuttle boosters did, but won't be fished from the Atlantic for reuse. The core stage will keep firing before separating and crashing into the Pacific in pieces. 2 hours after liftoff, an upper stage will send the capsule, Orion, racing toward the moon. 1. Moonship. NASA's high-tech, automated Orion capsule is named after the constellation, among the night sky's brightest. At 3 meters, 11 feet tall, it's roomier than Apollo's capsule, seating 4 astronauts instead of 3. For this test flight, a full-size dummy in an orange flight suit will occupy the commander's seat, rigged with vibration and acceleration sensors. 2 other mannequins made of material simulating human tissue, heads and female torsos, but no limbs, will measure cosmic radiation, one of the biggest risks of spaceflight. Unlike the rocket, Orion has launched before, making 2 laps around Earth in 2014. This time, the European Space Agency's service module will be attached for propulsion and solar power via 4 wings. 2. Flight plan. Orion's flight is supposed to last 6 weeks from its Florida liftoff to Pacific splashdown, twice as long as astronaut trips in order to tax the systems. It will take nearly a week to reach the moon, 386,000 kilometers, 240,000 miles, away. After whipping closely around the moon, the capsule will enter a distant orbit with a far point of 61,000 kilometers, 38,000 miles. That will put Orion 450,000 kilometers, 280,000 miles, from Earth, farther than Apollo. The big test comes at mission's end, as Orion hits the atmosphere at 40,000 kilometers per hour, 25,000 miles per hour, on its way to a splashdown in the Pacific. The heat shield uses the same material as the Apollo capsules to withstand re-entry temperatures of 2,750 degrees Celsius, 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the advanced design anticipates the faster, hotter returns by future Mars crews. Besides 3 test dummies, the flight has a slew of stowaways for deep space research. 10 shoebox-sized satellites will pop off once Orion is hurtling toward the moon. The problem is these so-called CubeSats were installed in the rocket a year ago, and the batteries for half of them couldn't be recharged as the launch kept getting delayed. NASA expects some to fail, given the low-cost, high-risk nature of these mini-satellites. The radiation-measuring CubeSats should be okay. Also, in the clear, a solar sail demo targeting an asteroid. In a Back to the Future salute, Orion will carry a few slivers of moon rocks collected by Apollo 11's Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in 1969, and a bolt from one of the rocket engines, salvaged from the sea a decade ago. Aldrin isn't attending the launch. According to NASA, but 3 of his former colleagues will be there. Apollo 7's Walter Cunningham, Apollo 10's Tom Stafford and Apollo 17's Harrison Schmitt, the next to last man to walk on the moon. 3. Apollo vs. Artemis. More than 50 years later, Apollo still stands as NASA's greatest achievement. Using 1960s technology, NASA took just 8 years to go from launching its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, and landing Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. By contrast, Artemis already has dragged on for more than a decade, despite building on the short-lived moon exploration program Constellation. 12 Apollo astronauts walked on the moon from 1969 through 1972, staying no longer than 3 days at a time. For Artemis, NASA will be drawing from a diverse astronaut pool currently numbering 42 and is extending the time crews will spend on the moon to at least a week. The goal is to create a long-term lunar presence that will grease the skids for sending people to Mars. NASA's Nelson promises to announce the first Artemis moon cruise once Orion is back on Earth. 5. What's next? There's a lot more to be done before astronauts step on the moon again. A second test flight will send 4 astronauts around the moon and back, perhaps as early as 2024. A year or so later, NASA aims to send another 4 up, with 2 of them touching down at the lunar South Pole. Orion doesn't come with its own lunar lander like the Apollo spacecraft did, so NASA has hired Elon Musk's SpaceX to provide its Starship spacecraft for the first Artemis moon landing. 2 other private companies are developing moonwalking suits. The sci-fi-looking Starship would link up with Orion at the moon and take a pair of astronauts to the surface and back to the capsule for the ride home. So far, Starship has only soared 10 kilometers, 6 miles. Musk wants to launch Starship around Earth on SpaceX's Super Heavy booster before attempting a moon landing without a crew. One hitch. Starship will need a fill-up at an Earth-orbiting fuel depot before heading to the moon. Yet after President Barack Obama took office, and the Government Accountability Office released a report about NASA's inability to estimate Constellation's cost, Obama pushed to scrap the program and signed off on the SLS rocket instead. Trump didn't scrap SLS. But he did change Obama's goal of launching astronauts to an asteroid, shifting priorities to Moon and Mars missions. Trump wanted to see Artemis land astronauts back on the moon in 2024. Such frequent changes to NASA's expensive priorities have led to cancellation after cancellation, a loss of about $20 billion, and years of wasted time and momentum. Biden seems to be a rare exception to the shifty presidential trend. He hasn't toyed with Trump's Artemis priority for NASA, and he's also kept Space Force intact. Buzz Aldrin said in testimony to Congress in 2015 that he believes the will to return to the moon must come from Capitol Hill. American leadership is inspiring the world by consistently doing what no other nation is capable of doing. We demonstrated that for a brief time 45 years ago. I do not believe we have done it since, Aldrin wrote in a statement. I believe it begins with a bipartisan congressional and administration commitment to sustained leadership. The real driving force behind that government commitment to return to the moon is the will of the American people, who vote for politicians and help shape their policy priorities. That public interest in lunar exploration has always been lukewarm. Even at the height of the Apollo program, after Aldrin and Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, only 53% of Americans said they thought the program was worth the cost. Most of the rest of the time, U.S. approval of Apollo hovered below 50%. Like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel.